In a desolate, ruined landscape, a young man's face twisted with rage as he glared at a blonde swordswoman. He roared a vow directly at his foe. Rufus lay lightless that he will be the one to deliver the final blow. Yet his vow went unfulfilled. He lay slain upon the cracked stones, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. As the victorious swordswoman and a companion stood over his fallen body, his defeat was total. The situation was undeniably grim, a future he could not escape. But the vision shattered. Rufus sat bolt upright in his bed, the memory of the battle still fresh. He reasoned with himself that as the heir to the Marquis of Lightless, such a pathetic death was impossible. It was an outcome that must never happen. Driven by this premonition, he raced from his room. His butler, Carlos, called out, asking where he was going. Without stopping, Rufus shouted that they must hurry to Rogue Belt. He had to stop this future from coming to pass. He paused in the hallway, his expression hardening with resolve. If that nightmare had even the slightest chance of becoming reality, he vowed to crush it completely, using everything at his disposal. The scene shifted to one day earlier. Within the opulent Lightless family manor, the young heir, Rufus lay lightless, sat pensively at a table. His personal butler, Carlos, approached, remarking that a pout would ruin the boy's cute face. Rufus, annoyed, insisted he was already 12 and demanded Carlos quit the cute talk. The butler playfully retorted that cuteness was justice. Pushed to his limit, Rufus asked with a cold tone if Carlos would like this to be his last day alive. Carlos responded with perfect composure, stating that a servant's life lasted only as long as their master's will. Rufus then affirmed his own conviction, declaring that he was always ready to lay down his own short life for his cause. To prove his maturity, Rufus declared that being called cute was disrespectful and pointed out that he even drank black coffee. As he took a sip, he privately appreciated the excellent aroma, recognizing the brewer's effort. From the doorway, Carlos watched his young master's performance with a knowing smile. He listened to his butler's dry remark, who wondered aloud who would brew the young master's coffee should he die, calling the prospect truly regrettable. After a brief pause, Rufus simply stated his butler's name. In response, Carlos declared with mock gravity that out of mercy, he would allow his master to live a long life. The young noble affirmed this, vowing to do his utmost to live a long and humble life. He then chided his butler, stating that he'd nearly given him a heart attack first thing in the morning. Carlos calmly retorted that the young master had been the one to provoke him, adding that the last time he'd seen him this upset was when Rufus fired one of his magic instructors. A memory surfaced clearly. Rufus, with a dismissive wave, had yelled that the instructor was fired, finding it laughable that someone so bold would dare try to teach him. Back in the present moment, he conceded that the incident had indeed been quite recent. His butler's expression softened. Adjusting his tie, Carlos gently suggested that perhaps telling him the reason for his distress might ease his mind even a little. A small knowing smile touched the young master's lips. He told Carlos that he had asked for it and warned him to prepare himself for a story that was neither cute nor music. The butler stood at attention, ready to listen as his young master prepared to speak. His story began with a simple ominous statement, his voice echoing over the image of his coffee cup. He had experienced an endless and unpleasant dream. He recounted the tale from his dream. It began with a commoner boy who enrolled in a magic academy steeped in class discrimination. There, despite being scorned by arrogant noble students, he and his companions faced a crisis that threatened their entire world. The boy ultimately triumphed, defeating the demon lords and the dark god who orchestrated the chaos, thereby saving everyone. The hero's journey culminated in him marrying the princess of that kingdom, and he ascended the throne to become its king. As the tale concluded, Carlos stood with a gentle smile, his eyes glistening. He remarked that it was quite a story filled with laughter and tears, much like a popular adventure novel. On the table, the young master's cup was now empty. His butler's emotional response did little to soothe the young master. Rufus, his face a mask of frustration, demanded coffee from Carlos, insisting that the dream he had was not entertaining in the slightest. He explained that he had been forced to sit through 5 entire chapters of a ridiculous commoner's rags to riches story. As Carlos served him, the butler acknowledged that his master had a point. The butler, however, began offering a literary critique, suggesting the story's pacing could be tightened and that the first 2 chapters showed too much empathy for the villain. He even added it would be more relatable to the masses. This infuriated Rufus, who retorted by asking if Carlos was his editor and telling him to try writing a book himself, his fist clenched tightly as he prepared to reveal the true reason for his anger. "Listen well," he commanded, explaining why the story had focused so much on the villain's point of view. He burst out that it was because he himself had been cast as a petty, insignificant villainous noble. Worse, he was killed off repeatedly in the most pathetic ways imaginable. Upon hearing this, Carlos looked on with clear amusement, asking what sort of wicked deeds his master had committed. Rufus began to recount his roles. In the first chapter, he was a villainous noble who simply mocked the protagonist for being a commoner. Carlos recalled the scene. He then specified that his role was even more minor. He was merely one of the main villain's lackeys, designated Lackey B. After that, he continued down the path of a minor villain. But in the second chapter, he reappeared as one of the 4 heavenly kings serving the second demon lord. His new identity was Shadow Wolf Rufus. Carlos was overcome with admiration, exclaiming that his master had an excellent sense for names. The butler stroked his chin, a smirk spreading across his face as he summarized the situation. The Shadow Wolf fought well, but met an unimpressive end midway through the chapter. He concluded that the young master was simply displeased at being cast as a villain who dies so early. His amusement was met with a sharp glare. Rufus' eyes narrowed as he delivered a quiet warning. "You shouldn't be laughing either." He pointed a finger at his butler, explaining that since Carlos was merely the opening act in a dream, he had died even before Rufus did. With a flourish, he bestowed upon him the title Dark Butler Carlos, a name the butler accepted with a proud pose. The butler was moved to tears, covering his mouth as he expressed sheer delight at the thought of protecting his young master, even within a dream. Rufus, however, flatly corrected him, stating that he hadn't been protected at all. They had both perished. With the matter settled, Carlos observed that his master's mood had improved and suggested they proceed with the day's schedule, to which Rufus simply agreed. As they prepared, Carlos outlined the plan for the day from the grand manor. Herbology practice in the garden that morning, followed by a lecture on economics in the afternoon. While heading to the garden, their path was suddenly obstructed by a massive fallen tree. Rufus questioned the site, and Carlos explained it was simply an old tree that had finally given way, blocking the path with remarkable neatness. A group of servants and gardeners were already gathered at the obstruction, their attention turning towards the young lord as he arrived. One of them asked the gardener what was happening. One of the gardeners stepped forward to explain the situation, informing Rufus that it would take a considerable amount of time to dismantle and move the tree. He suggested that the young master would have to take a detour through the woods, warning that his clothes might get dirty. The word detour seemed to strike a nerve. Rufus' gaze hardened as he informed the startled gardener that the value of time for a noble such as himself was vastly different from that of a commoner. Without another word, he leaped into the air, shouting a warning for the others to stand back. A shadowy, immense blade materialized in his grasp as he invoked its name. Dark Side, the shadowy weapon descended with incredible force, instantly obliterating the massive tree and sending splinters flying in every direction. He and Carlos walked away through a stone archway, leaving the servants behind. 2 of the maids watched them depart. One remarked on the incredible magic he displayed, though she couldn't help but notice his arrogant demeanor. As they watched, the gardener approached the maids, telling the one with her hair in buns that she was still a rookie. When she looked confused, he simply directed her gaze downward. Following his direction, they saw that the massive tree had been perfectly sectioned into uniform firewood-sized logs. The servants were stunned, realizing he had performed the feat not just for show, but to make their cleanup and reuse of the wood incredibly efficient. The gardener remarked that their lord was a difficult man to understand before ordering everyone to quickly haul the wood away. Meanwhile, as they walked along a stone path, Carlos gently advised his young master to perhaps show a bit more leniency when dealing with the commoners. Rufus countered, questioning if he hadn't just made their work significantly faster. Carlos clarified that this was not quite what he was referring to. The butler's words brought to mind a memory of a training session for the estate servants. In it, Carlos had explained to them that while the young master may seem arrogant and fixated on efficiency, he was in truth still just a boy. He had warned them, however, that such an attitude could easily earn him resentment from others. Returning to the present, Rufus scoffed at the notion, declaring that he would never coddle them. He asserted that showing any softness to commoners would only invite them to take immediate advantage. Beside him, Carlos let out a weary sigh. Rufus' conviction was absolute, rooted in a core belief. The duty of a noble was to protect the family name and ensure the prosperity of their land. This was why he dedicated himself so completely. While commoners toiled for their living, he as the heir to the marquis must study relentlessly to fulfill his noble duties. His training was all-encompassing, covering not only rhetoric, language, and martial arts, but also the complexities of economics, magic, and tedious practical etiquette. It was this deep-seated belief in duty and preparation that fueled his disgust for a certain kind of story. He internally questioned what a mere commoner possessing nothing but brute strength could possibly contribute to saving the world. As night fell, a strange dark particulate like ash or countless black feathers began to drift down from the sky, blanketing the estate in an ominous shroud. In his chambers, a young Rufus stood before a window clad in a simple robe. The night outside did little to soothe his thoughts as he reflected on a prophetic dream that continued to bother him. He had kept the details from his butler, Carlos, but the vision was far too vast and detailed to be dismissed as a mere dream. His reflection in the glass showed not his current self but the man he was to become. His mind drifted back to the contents of that story. A ridiculous tale set in the kingdom of Centuria where a commoner rose to become ruler. He recalled specific characters, including one who called himself the Second Demon Lord, Raymond Roy Noden's Galleon, and even recognized the names of the 4 heavenly kings who served under him. Sitting up in his bed, he puzzled over the name Raymond. Though he had never met the man, he knew he was supposed to be the son of a duke. He questioned why such a person would claim to be a demon lord and, more disturbingly, why he himself would end up submitting to him in the story. He lay back down, his thoughts racing. He wondered what, if anything, could possibly change for him once he entered the academy. As his eyes closed, a single unsettling question hung in his mind. Just what is going on? Suddenly, the scene shifted. A young man with spiky hair screamed his name, demanding to know if there was another way, questioning a sacrifice that had been made. The perspective snapped to a sharp, focused eye, and a realization dawned. This was the protagonist from yesterday's dream. The world around him was one of ruin, a field of broken pillars under a gray sky. He recognized it instantly. It was a different viewpoint, but this was the same moment, the same scene as the end of the dream. He was now his older self, the shadow wolf Rufus. With a look of utter disgust, he pushed someone away, shouting for the commoner not to come near him. The jarring reality hit him. He was living the dream right now. He realized that at this rate, he would die just as he did in the dream. Refusing to accept this fate, he prepared a dark ball spell, convinced that his future self could not be killed by something so weak. But then something was wrong. The protagonist looked on in shock, his mana rapidly depleting before the battle could even begin. Within a fractured memory, Rufus lay lightless, parried a blow from a blonde swordswoman. He internally seethed with frustration, questioning why he must feign composure and wondering if the persona of the shadow wolf was nothing but an idiotic charade. The battlefield came into view, identifying the combatants: Shadow Wolf, a young man named Abel, and the swordswoman, Farthiana. Her gaze was sharp and unwavering, her entire being focused on the coming strike as a faint aura surrounded her. She lunged, shouting Rufus' full name and vowing to be the one to kill him. He found himself frozen, unable to even defend himself. As she closed in, her expression twisted with rage and confusion. She screamed at him to stop, insisting that she didn't even know him. His forced composure shattered, replaced by raw, primal fear. A single thought consumed him. He did not want to die. The scene dissolved, and the pain became real for Abel. He clutched his head, crying out as the phantom agony coursed through him. He questioned how this could be happening in a dream, then looked on with a pained expression, wondering if Rufus had any other choice. Another memory surfaced. Abel stood opposite Rufus, warning him to stay back. Rufus recognized the scenario, but noted that the opening move was different this time. He calmly summoned a massive dark scythe, declaring that this encounter ended now. The result of that confrontation was agony. Abel screamed, his body engulfed in dark flames. The heat was unbearable, the smell of his own burning flesh filling his senses as a voice roared for the shadow wolf to die. The memory replayed from a different angle. Abel recalled the moment as the absolute worst again, questioning Rufus' path. This time, the cause of death was different, but just as painful. Rufus was struck down by wind magic, and with his last breath, he cursed humanity as traitors he would never forgive. Yet another scene of defeat unfolded. Rufus was surrounded by female warriors. One accused him of being responsible for someone named Norn. Another condemned him for torturing a village with heavy taxes. Wounded and resigned, Rufus admitted he didn't know who Norn was. He thought of the woman who invested in him only to repeatedly try to kill him and grimly told his executioners to finish it quickly. He found the entire cycle utterly ridiculous. No matter how many times the dream repeated, the shadow wolf was always defeated. He wondered why he had to wait for his turn, feeling as if he were in some kind of card game, and mused that his dream self should have a healing potion. He questioned if there was another way, silently warning some unseen summoner to stay away, feeling suffocated by their presence. His frustration stemmed from the memory of the onslaught. Surrounded, he was assailed by insults. "Nice robe, loser," they jeered, calling him a creep with strange eyes, but their words were just meaningless noise to him. As he fell, he began to lose all sense of reason, questioning if he was the one who was wrong. No longer knowing anything for certain. As Rufus' consciousness faded in the memory, the psychic backlash slammed into Abel. He cried out, clutching his head, begging for the repetitions to stop. He felt his body and soul being crushed down to the smallest grain of dust. In a vision, Rufus' phantom grabbed him, demanding to know what he wanted from him. The overwhelming sensation left him curled on the ground, helpless against the torrent of another's pain. Then another voice from the memories cut through the chaos, its owner's booted feet standing firm. "Let me count," it declared. The subject of the count was clear. Shadows. The final tally was staggering. 20,800,201. The sheer scale of the number seemed to warp reality itself, a blur of incomprehensible laws stretching into infinity. The weight of that number, of all those deaths, settled upon him as his eyes fluttered open. Lying in bed, he stared blankly at the ceiling, his gaze empty and exhausted, a simple choker around his neck. He awoke not in darkness, but within the familiar walls of his family's grand estate, the morning light filtering through the clouds. The return of consciousness was a violent one. He tumbled from his bed, crashing to the floor of his opulent room with a pained cry. His body ached, his mind a fog of terror. With a trembling hand, he pushed himself up, his voice a weak whisper as he called out for someone. His call was answered. The door burst open, and his butler, Carlos, rushed to his side, his face etched with concern. From the doorway, another young man watched the scene unfold. Staring at the familiar face, the boy needed confirmation, his voice trembling as he asked if it was truly Carlos. The butler knelt, his expression softening with reassurance. He confirmed his identity, stating that he, Carlos, his personal butler, was right there. The confirmation was all it took. The boy's composure shattered, and a wave of anguish washed over his face. The anguish erupted into a raw, desperate wail. He screamed his butler's name, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of his remembered horrors came crashing down. He lunged forward, burying his face in Carlos's uniform, his small hands clutching the fabric. "I don't want to die anymore," he sobbed, the plea torn from his throat, a desperate cry against a fate he had endured countless times. An hour passed. The storm of tears subsided, leaving a fragile calm. Carlos held the boy, who was now just sniffling softly, his body still trembling with the aftershocks of his terror. The butler's expression was one of deep pity for his young master. He pressed his face deeper into the butler's chest, inhaling deeply. The sudden movement and the sound of sniffing startled Carlos. Pulling back slightly, the boy looked up at his butler with a newfound clarity in his eyes. He stated simply that Carlos smelled of smoke. Carlos, the butler, appeared flustered, his face damp. He muttered to himself in embarrassment that he was used as a handkerchief and before his work hours had even begun. His young master, Rufus, now appearing as a young adult, watched him with a faint, knowing smile. He commended Carlos for his loyalty, noting that he would rush to his side even when off duty if he showed any sign of distress. The butler, observing him, thought to himself that Rufus seemed to have recovered. He continued speaking, explaining that seeing Rufus, who was always so full of confidence, be so shaken, had startled the other servants of the manor as well. As if to prove his point, two maids were seen peeking at Rufus from behind a partially open door down the hall. His attention snapped to them, and he shouted in embarrassment for them to get back to work. The maids apologized and quickly withdrew, one thinking his red nose was adorable, while the other wished she could comfort him. Rufus then quietly reflected that it was fortunate his parents were away, as his crying was likely loud enough to be heard throughout the mansion. He turned away from Carlos and walked toward his bedroom, dismissing the entire affair. He insisted it was nothing, that it wasn't funny, and that he simply had a nightmare. The butler followed him to the doorway, remarking that having nightmares 2 nights in a row was quite unfortunate. Standing by his bed, Rufus quietly affirmed yes. But the one truly experiencing the event realized it was far more than a nightmare. It was an ordeal of countless deaths and endless pain that nearly caused him to lose his very sense of self. Back in the room, Carlos placed a steadying hand on Rufus's shoulder. He told him that what he endured could not be called a dream. With a hardened expression, Rufus agreed, clarifying that it was an experience. His hands clenched the fabric of his robe, a silent testament to the weight of that word. He stood still as Carlos adjusted his formal attire, his mind consumed by a chilling thought. If that experience, his death, were to become reality. But he immediately rejected this grim possibility, declaring that he had no obligation to follow the path laid out in that story. His expression hardened with resolve. Rather than obey such a pitiful ending, he would fight it no matter how disgraceful his struggle might appear. He began to analyze the events of the vision, questioning the variables. Could he have won if he'd had enough mana? Would the outcome have been different if he hadn't been a villainous noble or one of the 4 heavenly kings he was forced to fight? As he pondered these hypotheticals, Carlos provided a crucial piece of information. The story was set to begin in 3 years when its characters entered the Magic Academy. Rufus considered if simply avoiding the protagonist would be enough to escape his fate, but quickly dismissed the idea as too simple. His mind flashed back to another detail from the vision. A female sailor who commanded a water spirit. She had screamed at him, accusing the lightless family of torturing her village with heavy taxes. The woman's words echoed in his memory, a clear motive for her actions. She held a deep grudge against it. The thought lingered as he sat at the table. He took a sip from his cup, calling out to his butler. Heavy taxes seem allowed. Carlos approached, inquiring if the warm milk was not to his liking. The young master was taken aback by the butler's perception, exclaiming, "Milk? You say?" He realized Carlos was correct, setting aside his surprise. He gave Carlos a direct order. He wanted to know if any villages in the lightless territory were suffering under heavy taxes. Carlos agreed to investigate but noted that their domain's taxes were not particularly high compared to others. Rufus sighed momentarily, annoyed at being treated like a child. He sat in contemplation, recalling a specific detail from the story of his future. It concerned taxes in a fishing village, one so harassed by rampaging sea monsters that it had lost its catch and could no longer pay its dues. As he mechanically cut into his meal, a thought crystallized: the village's name. If he could remember it, that name could be the key linking his dreadful dream to reality. But he struggled to grasp the memory, muttering fragments under his breath. Rogue Belt is butler. Carlos, having overheard, questioned the name. Rogue Belt, he asked, confirming that it was indeed a tiny fishing village located within the lightless family's territory. The confirmation struck him like lightning. His eyes widened in shock, and a manic grin spread across his face as the truth sank in. The fishing village of Rogue Belt actually existed. Carlos, perplexed, wondered aloud why he would be concerned with the taxes of such a small place. The moment of intensity passed, leaving Rufus staring at his plate. He had felt as though he were grasping at clouds with only a dream as a clue. Seeing his strange behavior, Carlos expressed concern, asking if he was unwell and offering to reschedule his plans for the day. But Rufus knew this was more than just a dream. If a village name he couldn't possibly have known matched reality, then the future he had witnessed, the future where he died, was starting to feel all too real. This terrifying realization spurred him into action. He shot up from his seat and rushed past his butler, shouting for Carlos. He declared that they were heading to Rogue Belt at once. As he hurried down the stairs, Carlos scrambled to intercept him, pleading for him to wait. The butler insisted the idea was unreasonable, listing the necessities for such a journey: a coachman, guards, and most importantly, permission from Lord Lightless. Rufus dismissed his concerns, stating he would report to his father himself afterward. He ordered Carlos to serve as both coachman and guard. Knowing he couldn't explain the real reason without being dismissed as ill, he pushed forward. Carlos protested vehemently, insisting he must at least inform the Lord. But Rufus was already gone, shouting his butler's name with urgency. He looked back at his butler, declaring a sudden craving for fresh fish, effective immediately. The excuse was thin, but Carlos, recognizing he had overstepped his bounds, bowed his head in acquiescence. He promised to prepare for the trip at once. With a simple command, Rufus dismissed him to the task as his butler walked away down the long shadowed hall. A dark resolve hardened within Rufus. He considered his life and everything in his possession to be his alone. No one, not even a god, would be forgiven for taking what was his without permission. A grim realization followed this thought. His own death, as foreseen in the vision, would also mean the death of Carlos. His expression set like stone, a fierce determination burning in his eyes. He would not be a passive victim. He vowed to strike first against fate, even if only by a single second, to rewrite the future and prevent his own demise. Rufus had a dream, though he considered it less a dream and more of a prophetic tale. According to this vision, in 3 years' time, he would die disgracefully at the hands of commoners. Unwilling to sit by and do nothing for 3 years, he resolved to change his own future. Setting out on a 4-day carriage journey to the frontier village of Rogue Belt. As his journey progressed, he noticed something strange in the air. It smelled of the sea. He and his butler, Carlos, walked along a cliffside path overlooking the water, their carriage laden with supplies following close behind. Carlos stopped and consulted a large map, confirming their location. This, he stated, was Rogue Belt, or so the map indicated. Before them lay their destination, the frontier fishing village of Rogue Belt, a small settlement nestled against the shore at the base of towering cliffs.